Once a reckless billionaire, Ethan Blake thought life was a game until a cruel bet led him to Mira, a woman scarred by the world yet unbroken. What began as a shallow challenge unraveled into a journey of redemption, trust, and love. But can broken beginnings truly lead to forever? Ethan Blake was a man who thrived on challenges. A self-made millionaire in his early 30s, Ethan embodied charm and confidence. Known for his devil-may-care attitude and insatiable appetite for risks, he was the kind of man who never turned down a dare. The glittering social circles he frequented adored him for his charisma and sharp wit. Yet, those closer to him knew about his tendency to push boundaries, often at the expense of others. One evening during a lavish party at his penthouse, Ethan found himself caught in yet another outrageous challenge. His friends, a group of equally wealthy and reckless individuals, had grown tired of his repeated victories in their games of wit and nerve. Determined to outdo themselves, they devised a proposal that would truly test Ethan's limits. "Ethan," drawled Lucas, his closest friend and fiercest rival, "we've got a bet for you, one that even you might not have the guts to accept." Ethan leaned back in his leather armchair, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "I'm listening," he said, a sly smile tugging at his lips. Lucas smirked. "We dare you to marry the ugliest person we can find, someone so far beneath your usual standards that it'll make headlines. And here's the catch. You have to stay married for at least a week." Laughter erupted around the room, but Ethan's smile faltered for a brief moment. He prided himself on his impeccable taste, and the very idea of this challenge felt like an affront to his carefully curated image. Yet, the mocking laughter of his friends grated on his nerves, stoking his competitive spirit. "And what's in it for me?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. Lucas leaned forward, his grin widening. $10 million. Straight to your favourite charity, or your pocket. We don't care. All you have to do is go through with it. The room fell silent as everyone watched Ethan. He pretended to deliberate, but deep down, he knew he couldn't resist the temptation to prove his friends wrong. Finally, he raised his glass in a mock toast. "You've got a deal." Cheers erupted, and the bet was set in motion. The next day, Ethan's friends scoured the city for someone who fit the bill. Relentless in their search, they were determined to find someone who would push Ethan's tolerance to its limits. Eventually, they found her, Mira. Mira sat on the corner of a bustling street, her tattered clothes barely shielding her from the evening chill. Her dishevelled hair framed a face marred by scars, each one a silent testimony to her hardships and survival. Her sharp brown eyes scanned the crowd, searching for kind faces, but finding none. Life on the streets had hardened her, but it hadn't broken her spirit. When Ethan approached her, Mira's first instinct was to dismiss him as just another condescending passerby. She didn't need anyone's pity, but there was something different about him, a mixture of curiosity and amusement that piqued her interest. "You're Mira, right?" Ethan asked, crouching to meet her gaze. His tone was calm, but there was a glimmer of intrigue in his eyes. She narrowed her eyes. "Who's asking?" Ethan smirked. "My name is Ethan Blake. I have a proposition for you." Mira scoffed. "I'm not interested in whatever scam you're running." Ethan chuckled. "It's not a scam. It's a business arrangement. I'm willing to pay you a significant amount of money to marry me." Mira stared at him, stunned. Of all the ridiculous things she had heard on the streets, this had to top the list. "You want to marry me?" she asked incredulously. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Ethan said, his expression unreadable. "Just 1 week. After that, you'll be free to go, with more money than you've ever dreamed of." Mira hesitated. She had spent years struggling to survive, and this offer, absurd as it seemed, could change her life. But a part of her resented the idea of being used as a pawn in whatever game this man was playing. "Why me?" she finally asked. Ethan's smirk faded, replaced by a hint of vulnerability. "Let's just say, I have something to prove. Mira studied him for a long moment. Despite her reservations, she couldn't ignore the opportunity he was offering. Fine, she said, her voice steady. But I have conditions. You treat me with respect, and you keep your promises. Deal, Ethan said, extending his hand. Mira shook it, sealing the most unlikely agreement of her life. As they walked away from the street corner, neither of them realized how profoundly this bet would change their lives. The wedding day arrived far sooner than either Ethan or Mira had anticipated. Ethan left all the preparations to his staff, treating the occasion more like a business transaction than a celebration. To him, it was just another challenge to conquer, a spectacle for his friends to witness. But for Mira, it was surreal and nerve-wracking, an unfamiliar world she had never dreamed of stepping into. Ethan's mansion buzzed with activity as florists, caterers, and event coordinators transformed the grand ballroom into a venue worthy of a billionaire. The room shimmered with gold and ivory decorations, chandeliers casting a warm glow over the extravagant setup. The guest list included high-profile socialites, business magnates, and, of course, Ethan's closest friends, the very people who had orchestrated this humiliating bet. As the ceremony began, Ethan stood at the altar, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo that accentuated his sharp features and confident demeanor. He scanned the room, his gaze briefly meeting Lucas's. His friend smirked, silently reminding him of the stakes. Ethan gave a small nod, masking his unease with a practiced smile. The crowd fell silent as the double doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Mira appeared, escorted by Thomas, Ethan's loyal butler, who had taken it upon himself to ensure she felt as comfortable as possible. Her appearance drew audible gasps from the audience. She wore a simple white gown that, while elegant, did little to conceal the scars on her face and arms. Her dishevelled hair had been tamed into a neat bun, and a touch of makeup softened her features, but it couldn't hide the years of hardship etched into her skin. Mira's steps were slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed ahead as she avoided the judgmental stares of the guests. Whispers and muffled laughter rippled through the crowd, but her expression remained stoic. She had endured worse on the streets and wasn't about to let these people see her falter. Ethan's breath hitched as he watched her approach. Despite her scars and the awkwardness of her gait, there was an undeniable dignity in the way she carried herself. It was a quiet strength he hadn't noticed before, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a pang of guilt for putting her through this ordeal. When Mira reached the altar, Ethan offered her his hand. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. Her touch was warm but firm, a silent reminder that she wasn't as fragile as she might seem. The officiant began the ceremony, reciting the traditional vows that seemed almost absurd in this context. As Ethan repeated the words, "To have and to hold, in sickness and in health," he couldn't help but glance at Mira. Her eyes met his briefly, and in that moment, he saw something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't resentment or fear, but a quiet defiance, as if she were daring him to see beyond her appearance. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan leaned in to kiss Mira. The kiss was brief and perfunctory, more of a formality than an expression of affection. Still, it was enough to elicit a few snickers from the crowd. Ethan straightened, his jaw tightening as he glanced at his friends. Lucas gave him an exaggerated thumbs up, his grin mocking. The reception that followed was a spectacle of excess. Guests mingled over champagne and hors d'oeuvres, their conversations laced with thinly veiled disdain for the unlikely bride. Mira stayed close to Thomas, who had taken it upon himself to act as her guardian for the evening. She avoided the crowd, finding solace in a quiet corner of the room. Ethan, meanwhile, worked the room, greeting guests and maintaining the facade of a gracious host. But his attention kept drifting to Mira, who stood apart from the crowd like a solitary figure in a painting. Her isolation stirred something in him, a sense of responsibility he hadn't anticipated. For the first time, he began to question the morality of the bet and his role in it. As the evening wore on, Ethan approached Mira, Are you holding up okay? He asked, his tone unusually gentle. Mira looked up at him, her expression unreadable. I've survived worse, she said simply, her voice steady. But I'm not sure I'll ever understand people like you. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Mira gestured to the crowd. All this, the money, the power, the games you play. You think it makes you untouchable, but it's all so hollow. Her words hit Ethan harder than he expected. For years he had thrived on the adoration of people like these, but in that moment he couldn't deny the truth in her observation. The night ended with Ethan escorting Mira to the guest suite prepared for her. As they reached the door, he hesitated. Good night, Mira, he said quietly. She nodded, her expression softening slightly. Good night, Ethan. As Ethan walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this bet was going to be far more complicated than he had anticipated. The first morning of their married life dawned in Ethan's sprawling mansion, a place that now felt eerily empty despite its grandeur. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, casting golden patterns on the marble floors. Mira woke early, her body instinctively alert from years of sleeping on the streets. For a moment she lay still, taking in the unfamiliar softness of the bed, the sheer expanse of the room, and the oppressive quiet that surrounded her. Ethan, meanwhile, lingered in his private study, sipping his morning coffee and staring at the untouched breakfast tray before him. His mind replayed the events of the previous day, and an inexplicable weight settled in his chest. For the first time, the magnitude of his actions began to sink in. He had married a woman he barely knew, a woman whose very presence was a constant reminder of the bet he now regretted more than he cared to admit. Mira emerged from her room, her steps tentative as she explored the mansion. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming, but she refused to let it intimidate her. She wandered into the kitchen where the staff froze, unsure of how to address her. Thomas, ever the mediator, stepped in. Good morning, Mrs. Blake, he said warmly, earning a small, grateful smile from Mira. Just Mira, she corrected softly, her voice steady but kind. Mrs. Blake doesn't feel quite right. Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He guided her to a small breakfast table near the garden, away from the imposing dining hall. This might feel a bit more comfortable, he suggested, and Mira appreciated his thoughtfulness. As she sat down, Ethan entered the room, his presence commanding as always. He paused when he saw her, his eyes briefly scanning her face for any sign of discomfort. Morning, he said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. Good morning, Mira replied, her tone polite but distant. Their interaction was brief, but it carried an undercurrent of tension, a mix of uncertainty, curiosity, and unspoken questions. Throughout the day, Ethan found himself observing Mira from a distance. She moved through the mansion with a quiet grace, her hands trailing over the polished banisters and intricate carvings, as if trying to familiarize herself with this alien world. Despite her outward composure, he noticed the weight of her new reality in the way her shoulders occasionally tensed, the way her gaze lingered on the staff who avoided her eyes. By evening, Ethan decided to break the silence. He found Mira in the library, her fingers tracing the spines of books she likely never had the chance to read. Do you like to read? He asked, his voice softer than usual. Mira turned to him, surprised by the question. I used to, she admitted, before life got complicated. Ethan nodded, sensing there was more to her story than she was willing to share. You can read anything you want here, he said. The library is yours. Mira studied him for a moment, as if trying to discern his intentions. Thank you, she said finally, her voice tinged with cautious gratitude. As days turned into weeks, their interactions grew less strained. Ethan began to see beyond Mira's scars and guarded demeanor, catching glimpses of her wit, intelligence, and resilience. Mira, in turn, started to notice moments of vulnerability in Ethan, a side of him that contradicted the image of the arrogant millionaire she had initially judged. Despite the progress, there was still an invisible wall between them, built from years of mistrust, pain, and the unresolved truth about the bet that had brought them together. But as they shared quiet moments, a walk through the garden, a conversation over tea, the foundation of something deeper began to take shape. Neither of them was ready to acknowledge it yet, but the walls between them were beginning to crack. Ethan had always thought of his mansion as a fortress of luxury, a place where no trace of hardship could penetrate. But Mira's presence was reshaping the atmosphere in subtle, unexpected ways. For the first time, he found himself questioning not only his choices, but the emptiness of the life he'd built around them. One rainy afternoon, Ethan returned from a business meeting to find Mira in the music room. He rarely used it, having long since abandoned the piano that sat at its center. Yet there she was, her fingers dancing tentatively over the keys, coaxing a hauntingly beautiful melody from the instrument. Her posture was stiff, but her eyes held a depth of focus Ethan had never seen before. "I didn't know you played," he said, startling her. Mira's hands froze mid-note and she turned to face him. "I don't... Not really," she said quietly. "I used to listen to my mother play. It's been years, but I guess I remember some of it." Ethan approached the piano, his curiosity piqued. "You're good," he said, sitting beside her. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mira hesitated, her fingers brushing against the keys. "Because it doesn't matter, not in a place like this." "It matters to me," Ethan said, surprising himself with the sincerity of his words. "Play something else. Please." Mira glanced at him, searching his face for traces of mockery, but found none. Taking a deep breath, she began another piece, a soft, melancholic tune that filled the room with a poignant energy. Ethan watched her, captivated by the transformation in her expression. For the first time, she seemed unguarded, her usual defenses replaced by a quiet vulnerability. When the song ended, Ethan clapped softly. "That was beautiful," he said. "You're full of surprises, Mira." She looked away, a faint blush colouring her cheeks. "There's not much to me, really." Ethan frowned, leaning closer. "That's not true. I think you've just spent too long hiding the best parts of yourself." Mira's gaze snapped back to his, her eyes narrowing. "And whose fault is that?" "People like you don't look past what's on the surface." Her words stung, but Ethan didn't shy away from them. "Maybe I didn't before," he admitted. "But I'm trying now." Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas, who entered the room carrying a notebook. "I found this while organising some of the storage," he said, handing it to Mira. "It looked like something you might want." Mira's hands trembled as she took the notebook. Opening it, she revealed pages filled with sketches and poetry, fragments of her life before the streets. Her breath caught as she traced the familiar lines, memories flooding back with each stroke of the pencil. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In a box labelled Mira," Thomas replied. "I assume it was among the few things you brought with you." Ethan watched as tears welled in Mira's eyes. "You drew these?" he asked, his tone awed. She nodded, her voice breaking. "It's all I had left of my family. I thought it was lost forever." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt oddly natural. "You're more talented than I ever imagined," he said. "Thank you for sharing this with me." In that moment, something shifted between them. The walls Mira had built around herself began to crack, and Ethan felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest, a sense of connection he hadn't experienced in years. He realized that Mira wasn't just the woman he had married on a whim. She was someone extraordinary, and he wanted to know every facet of her story. The night was quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves outside the grand windows of Ethan's mansion. The day's rain had left a lingering coolness in the air, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the crackling fireplace in Mira's room. She sat at the edge of her bed, her hands trembling slightly as she held the delicate silk scarf that concealed a part of her past she had carefully hidden. A knock at the door broke the silence. She hesitated before calling out, "Come in." Ethan stepped inside, his expression unusually soft. "I wanted to check on you," he said. closing the door behind him. It's been a long day. Mira nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. Yes, it has. Ethan approached her cautiously, as if sensing her unease. You don't have to stay in here if you don't want to. The house is yours too. She gave a small, humorless laugh. Is it? Because it doesn't feel like it. Ethan frowned, her words cutting deeper than he expected. I know this situation is far from normal, he said, sitting on the armchair across from her. But I meant what I said earlier. I want to try. Mira studied him, her expression guarded. Try what, Ethan? To make this farce of a marriage work? To prove to your friends that you can endure a week of me? He winced at her bluntness, but didn't look away. No, he said firmly. To make amends for how this started, to understand you. Her breath hitched, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, the defenses she had meticulously built wavered. Taking a deep breath, she said, If you want to understand me, then you need to know the truth. Ethan's brow furrowed. The truth? Mira nodded, her fingers gripping the scarf tightly. I haven't been completely honest with you. I've hidden things because it was easier to survive that way. She stood and turned toward the mirror, her reflection illuminated by the soft glow of the firelight. Slowly, she began untying the scarf, revealing the delicate features of her face beneath. The scars that had seemed permanent washed away with the remnants of makeup, leaving behind a smooth complexion that radiated beauty. Ethan's breath caught. Mira. She met his gaze in the mirror, her eyes filled with a mix of vulnerability and defiance. I used the scars as a shield, she said, her voice trembling. They made people look away, made them dismiss me. On the streets, being invisible was the only way to survive. Ethan rose from his chair, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. Why would you do that to yourself? He asked, his tone a mixture of shock and curiosity. Mira turned to face him fully, clutching the scarf in her hands, because being noticed, being seen as beautiful, only brought danger. People wanted to take advantage of me, use me. I couldn't trust anyone. The scars kept them at bay. Ethan took a hesitant step closer. You've been through more than I could have imagined, he said softly. But you don't have to hide anymore, not here. Mira's eyes glistened with unshed tears. You say that now, but this was never real for you. It was a bet. He flinched, guilt washing over him. You're right, he admitted. It started as a bet, and for that I'm sorry. But it's not a game to me anymore. I see you, Mira, the real you. And I want to know more. Her lip quivered, and she quickly turned away, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. She had spent so long guarding her heart that the prospect of vulnerability terrified her. Yet, there was something in Ethan's eyes, a genuine warmth that made her want to believe him. I don't know if I can trust you, she whispered. Then let me prove myself, he said, his voice steady. Not with words, but with actions. I don't want you to feel like you have to hide or run anymore. Not from me. Mira's heart ached with conflicting emotions. She wanted to push him away, to protect herself, but a small part of her yearned to believe that he meant what he said. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope, a fragile thing, but enough to make her pause. I'll hold you to that, she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. If you break your promise, I'll walk away. Ethan nodded, his expression solemn. You have my word. They stood in silence, the weight of their unspoken emotions filling the room. For Ethan, the night marked the beginning of something he hadn't anticipated, a chance to become someone better. And for Mira, it was the first step toward trusting someone who might just see her for who she truly was. Ethan found himself staring at the morning sun, filtering through his study windows, the memory of the previous night vivid in his mind. Mira's revelation lingered with him, a sharp reminder of how much he still had to learn about her. And himself. He had started this bet with arrogance, but now something deeper had taken hold. He wanted to be a man worthy of her trust. The first step, he decided, was to distance himself from the toxic influence of his so-called friends. Lucas had been the mastermind behind the bet, but Ethan realized he had allowed himself to be complicit. That morning, he made the decision to confront his circle of friends and draw a line in the sand. Ethan met Lucas at their usual cafe, but the atmosphere between them was tense. "This has gone too far," Ethan said bluntly, cutting off Lucas's attempt at small talk. "I won't be a part of these games anymore." Lucas leaned back in his chair, a smirk on his face. "Don't tell me you're catching feelings for her, Ethan. That wasn't part of the deal." "The deal was wrong," Ethan snapped. "Mira isn't some pawn in your twisted game. She's a person, a remarkable one, and I'm done treating her like anything less." Lucas's smirk faltered, replaced by a sneer. "You're really serious about this? You're going to let some charity case change who you are?" "Maybe it's about time I did," Ethan replied, his tone firm. "I'm tired of pretending this shallow lifestyle means anything." Walking away from Lucas and the circle of friends who once validated him felt like shedding a heavy burden. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was reclaiming control over his life. Back at the mansion, Ethan threw himself into learning more about the charitable organizations Mira had mentioned in passing. He reached out to local shelters, arranging meetings to understand their needs and how he could help. At first, Mira was skeptical of his sudden interest. But as she watched him dive headfirst into the work, her guarded walls began to lower. One afternoon, Ethan invited Mira to join him on a visit to a shelter he had pledged to support. The place was bustling with activity, volunteers serving meals, children playing in a small courtyard, and residents sharing stories over cups of coffee. Mira seemed at home here, her demeanor softening as she spoke with the staff and residents. "You seem different here," Ethan observed as they walked through the courtyard. Mira glanced at him, a hint of a smile on her lips. "This was my life for a long time," she said quietly. "I know what it feels like to have nothing and to rely on the kindness of strangers." Ethan nodded, his respect for her growing with each passing moment. "I want to help," he said. "Not just with money, but with real change." Mira looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any trace of insincerity. Finding none, she gave him a small nod. "Then we'll do it together," she said. Over the weeks that followed, Ethan and Mira began working as a team. They organized fundraisers, connected with community leaders, and even hosted events at the mansion to raise awareness for the causes they supported. Their partnership became a source of inspiration, not just for the people they helped, but for each other. For Ethan, every step was a chance to prove to Mira that his transformation was genuine. And for Mira, it was a reminder that trust could be rebuilt, one action at a time. As they spent more time together, the line between obligation and genuine connection blurred, and something undeniably real began to blossom between them. Weeks passed, and Mira began to feel a cautious sense of stability in her new life. Ethan's transformation was undeniable. He was no longer the arrogant man who had approached her with a cruel bet. He had become someone thoughtful, empathetic, and determined to make a difference. Yet, despite the progress they had made together, a nagging unease lingered in Mira's heart. The knowledge of how their relationship had begun was a shadow she couldn't ignore. One evening, as Ethan prepared for a charity gala they had organized, Mira wandered into the study where he had left his phone charging. A notification caught her eye, a text from Lucas. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she tapped to open the message. "Still can't believe you've lasted this long with her. Guess the bet was worth it after all, huh?" Mira's heart dropped. The words felt like a slap, confirming the very thing she had tried to push out of her mind. Her hands trembled as she placed the phone back on the desk. The walls she had started to let down came crashing back, reinforced by the betrayal she felt. Ethan found her sitting in the corner of the room, her face pale and her expression distant. "Mira," he said gently, concern lacing his voice. "Is everything okay?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. "You should have deleted the text," she said flatly. His brow furrowed in confusion until realization dawned. "Mira, I can explain—" "Don't," she interrupted, standing abruptly. "I don't need excuses. I already knew about the bet, Ethan. But I let myself believe that maybe you'd changed, that this wasn't all a lie." Ethan took a step toward her, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "It wasn't a lie. It started horribly, I won't deny that, but everything we've done since then, everything I've done, it's real, Mira. You have to believe me." "How can I?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "How can I trust anything you say when it all began as a joke? A game to amuse you and your friends?" The weight of her words crushed him. Ethan realized that no matter how much he had changed, the foundation of their relationship was built on a betrayal he couldn't undo. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I don't deserve your trust, but I'm asking for a chance to earn it." Mira shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know if I can give you that." Before he could respond, she brushed past him and left the room. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the mansion, leaving Ethan standing alone, his heart heavy with regret. The following days were some of the hardest of Ethan's life. Mira had moved into a small apartment she had rented with the money he had given her during their agreement. Though he respected her need for space, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something precious. Ethan threw himself into his work, using the charity projects as a way to channel his guilt and heartbreak. He visited shelters, attended meetings, and volunteered his time, actions that felt hollow without Mira by his side. Every interaction reminded him of her strength, her resilience, and the way she had inspired him to be better. Mira, meanwhile, struggled to adjust to her new independence. She had spent years surviving on her own, but the time she had spent with Ethan had changed her. She missed the man he had become, the one who had shown her kindness and respect, the one who had made her believe in possibilities she had long abandoned. Yet, the pain of betrayal lingered, a barrier she couldn't easily overcome. One evening, Ethan showed up at the shelter where Mira volunteered. He stood in the doorway looking out of place yet determined. When their eyes met, she froze, unsure of how to react. "I'm not here to force anything," he said, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "I just want to help." She hesitated before nodding, allowing him to join her in serving dinner to the residents. They worked side by side in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken emotions. As the evening wore on, Ethan finally broke the silence. "Mira, I know I can't erase what I did," he said quietly, "but I need you to know that meeting you changed me. You made me see the world and myself in a way I never had before, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Mira glanced at him, her expression softening despite herself. "I don't need grand gestures or apologies, Ethan. I just need to know that what you feel is real." "It is," he said earnestly. "More real than anything I've ever known." Her walls wavered, but she held firm. "If you want me to believe that, then keep showing me. Not with words, but with actions." Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of her request. "I will," he promised. As they parted ways that night, Mira felt a flicker of hope reignite in her chest. It was fragile, but it was enough to make her consider the possibility of a future where trust could be rebuilt, one step at a time. Ethan took Mira's words to heart, pouring himself into the work they had started together. Days turned into weeks as he continued to show her, through actions, how much he had changed. He became a regular presence at the shelter, not just as a donor but as a volunteer. He served meals, cleaned tables, and spent time talking with residents. Slowly, his presence began to feel less like a grand gesture and more like a genuine commitment to the cause. Mira watched from a distance at first, wary of his persistence, but as time passed, she couldn't deny the sincerity in his efforts. He wasn't just trying to win her back, he was trying to become a better man. Each small act of kindness chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. One afternoon, Ethan invited Mira to the mansion for a fundraiser he had organized. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to face the world they had once inhabited together. But his earnest request and the progress she had seen in him convinced her to give him a chance. The mansion was transformed into a warm, welcoming space. Gone were the ostentatious displays of wealth that had once defined Ethan's events. Instead, the focus was on the cause. Photographs of the shelter's residents and their stories adorned the walls, and the event featured performances and speeches from those whose lives had been impacted by the work Mira and Ethan had championed. Mira found herself moved by the evening. As she watched Ethan speak to the crowd, his voice steady and passionate, she saw a man who had truly changed. His words weren't just about the money they had raised, but about the importance of compassion and understanding. For the first time, Mira felt the weight of her mistrust begin to lift. After the event, Ethan approached her in the garden, where she had stepped out for a moment of quiet. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "It means more to me than you know." Mira turned to him, her expression unreadable. "It was a beautiful event," she admitted. "You've done a lot of good." "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "You inspired me, Mira. You made me want to be better." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe him fully. "You've come a long way, Ethan," she said. "And so have I." He took a step closer, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I don't want to lose what we've built, Mira. I know I can't erase the past, but I want a chance to build a future with you." Mira hesitated, the weight of her fears and hopes colliding, but as she looked at him, she saw the truth in his eyes, a truth she couldn't ignore. "I think we can try," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Relief and joy washed over Ethan's face. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise I won't let you down." Their journey was far from over, but in that moment, they both felt a sense of peace. Together, they had faced their flaws and fears, and now they were ready to take the next step, one built on trust, respect, and the undeniable bond they had forged.